In the late 18th century, France was a nation of grandeur and decay, brilliance and misery, majesty and injustice. The old regime, as it came to be known, was a system rooted in tradition, hierarchy, and privilege. For centuries, it had seemed unshakable. Yet by the 1780s, cracks in its foundation were widening, and the storm of revolution was beginning to gather. At the heart of France's society stood the three estates. The first estate, the clergy, enjoyed vast influence. Though it represented less than 1% of the population, it owned around 10% of the land in France. The church collected tithes from peasants, controlled education, and shaped much of public life. Many high-ranking clergy were aristocrats themselves, living in comfort and splendor. Meanwhile, parish priests often lived modestly, closer to the peasants they served, and shared some of their hardships. The second estate, the nobility, was similarly privileged. Comprising roughly 2% of the population, nobles held about a quarter of French land. They enjoyed exemptions from many taxes, held top positions in the military and government, and lived in estates or at the dazzling court of Versailles. Though some nobles were progressive, advocating reform, many were deeply protective of their privileges. The vast majority of the French people, nearly 97%, belonged to the Third Estate, but this group was not homogeneous. At the top were the bourgeoisie, the wealthy middle class, lawyers, merchants, financiers, and intellectuals. Many were educated, prosperous, and frustrated by their exclusion from political power. Below them were artisans and urban workers, who lived precarious lives in the crowded streets of Paris and other cities, dependent on food prices and wages that often left them hungry. At the bottom were the peasants, who made up about 4/5 of the population. Bound by feudal dues, taxes, and obligations to their landlords and the state, they carried the heaviest burdens in France while enjoying the fewest privileges. The inequality of the estates was not merely a matter of wealth but of law. Nobles could hunt on peasant land, enjoy access to royal appointments, and avoid taxes like the taille, the main direct tax, while peasants and townspeople bore the crushing fiscal load. Even the clergy were divided. Bishops and abbots lived in opulence, while parish priests often sympathized with the poor. The system was deeply resented by those who labored and paid, but it was the only order the kingdom had known. Adding to this fragile social structure was a financial crisis of immense proportions. By the late 1780s, France was drowning in debt. Decades of war, most recently the costly support for the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. The extravagant spending of the monarchy, particularly under Louis XVI and his famously lavish queen, Marie Antoinette, worsened public resentment. Attempts at reform, including new taxes on the nobility, were met with fierce resistance. The monarchy's financial ministers tried again and again to implement solutions, but they were blocked by entrenched interests. The crown's credibility sank further with every failed attempt. The economic burden fell hardest on ordinary people. Harvest failures in the 1780s caused bread prices to skyrocket. Bread was the staple of the French diet, and when it became scarce, desperation spread. Hungry mobs rioted in the streets of Paris and other cities, demanding relief. For peasants already struggling under feudal dues, forced labor on roads, and crushing taxation, hunger made daily life unbearable. As the monarchy faltered, Enlightenment ideas spread through France like wildfire. The writings of Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Diderot challenged traditional authority and promoted ideals of reason, liberty, and equality. Rousseau's notion of popular sovereignty and Montesquieu's theory of the separation of powers inspired many in the Third Estate to question why a privileged minority should govern the majority. Salons in Paris buzzed with radical discussions. Pamphlets circulated widely, denouncing injustice and demanding change. Meanwhile, the monarchy seemed increasingly out of touch. Louis XVI was not without intelligence or good intentions, but he was indecisive, easily swayed, and ill-suited to the crisis. Marie Antoinette, the Austrian-born queen, became a symbol of royal excess. Though much of the criticism directed at her was exaggerated or unfair, her reputation as Madame Deficit inflamed public anger. To the starving poor, tales of her lavish spending, extravagant dresses, and diamond jewelry epitomized the arrogance of Versailles. The disconnect between rulers and subjects reached a breaking point in 1789. Facing bankruptcy, Louis XVI reluctantly called the Estates General, a general assembly of representatives from all three estates, for the first time since 1614. It was a desperate attempt to resolve the financial crisis by seeking broader support for reform. But the very act of convening the Estates General opened a door that could not be closed. For the people of the Third Estate, this was a rare chance to make their voices heard. In towns and villages across France, communities prepared cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances to be presented to the king. These documents revealed the anger and hopes of the common people, demands for fairer taxation, an end to feudal dues, more opportunities for advancement and equality before the law. Though varied, the cahiers shared a common theme. The old regime was unjust, and reform was urgent. When the Estates General met at Versailles in May 1789, the stage was set for confrontation. The First and Second Estates expected to preserve their privileges, while the Third Estate demanded fundamental change. The rules of voting, by estate rather than by head, ensured that the two privileged estates could outvote the third, despite representing a tiny minority of the population. To the frustrated delegates of the Third Estate, this was intolerable. In June, they took a daring step. Declaring themselves the National Assembly, they vowed to represent the French people and refused to disband until they had written a new constitution. In a moment of high drama, they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court after being locked out of their meeting hall, swearing the now famous tennis court oath. Their stand marked the first open act of defiance against the monarchy. The seeds of revolution had been planted. A system that had endured for centuries was being challenged not just by hunger, debt, and discontent, but by a new vision of society, one founded on liberty, equality, and the sovereignty of the people. The storm was about to break. The summer of 1789 was unlike any France had ever known. What began as a crisis of finance and privilege had escalated into an outright challenge to the authority of the monarchy. The National Assembly, born from the defiance of the Third Estate, had declared itself the voice of the French people. But while debates raged in Versailles, the streets of Paris were heating with unrest. Tension mounted when rumors spread that the king was planning to dissolve the National Assembly by force. Royal troops were seen gathering around Paris, their presence interpreted as a threat of repression. At the same time, bread prices soared and the working-class Parisians, known as the sans-culottes because they wore trousers instead of the knee breeches favored by the aristocracy, were restless, hungry, and furious. The spark came on July 14, 1789, when a crowd of Parisians stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress prison that had become a symbol of royal tyranny. Though it held only a handful of prisoners, the Bastille represented everything the people despised about the old regime: arbitrary imprisonment, absolute power, and fear. After hours of fierce fighting, the fortress fell. The head of its governor was paraded through the streets on a pike. The storming of the Bastille sent shockwaves across France. It was not just the fall of a prison, it was the birth of a revolution. In the countryside, the spirit of revolt spread rapidly. The so-called Great Fear swept through villages as peasants, terrified of noble conspiracies to crush them, rose up against their landlords. They attacked manor houses, burned feudal records, and demanded an end to centuries-old obligations. The aristocracy, once untouchable, now felt vulnerable before the fury of the common people. At Versailles, the National Assembly responded to the chaos with decisive action. On the night of August 4, 1789, in a session that stretched into the early hours, noble deputies stood one after another to renounce their privileges. Feudal dues, hunting rights, tax exemptions, and seigneurial authority were abolished in a sweeping declaration. The old order of inequality was shattered. A few weeks later, the Assembly issued one of the revolution's most enduring documents, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and the American Declaration of Independence, it proclaimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It asserted liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression as natural rights. Sovereignty, it declared, resided in the nation, not the king. Though women and slaves were excluded, the Declaration was revolutionary in scope, and its influence would spread far beyond France. Yet even as ideas of liberty and equality spread, France remained unstable. Food shortages continued and distrust of the monarchy grew. In October 1789, thousands of Parisian women, angry over the high price of bread, marched to Versailles. Their numbers swelled as men joined them, forming a massive crowd that stormed the palace. Confronting the royal family, they demanded bread and reform. In the end, the king and queen were forced to return to Paris under the watchful eyes of the people. The monarchy, once distant and majestic at Versailles, was now a prisoner of the revolution. Over the next 2 years, the National Assembly worked to reshape France. The church, long a pillar of the old regime, faced sweeping changes. In 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy placed the church under state authority, requiring priests to swear loyalty to the new order. This deeply divided French society, pitting revolutionaries against devout Catholics, especially in rural areas. What had begun as a political revolution was now becoming a cultural and spiritual one as well. Meanwhile, the king struggled with his new role. Louis XVI had reluctantly accepted the National Assembly's authority, but he never fully embraced the revolution. In June 1791, in an event that shocked France, the royal family attempted to flee the country. Disguised as commoners, they slipped out of Paris by carriage, hoping to rally counter-revolutionary forces in the east. But at the town of Varennes, they were recognized and arrested. The king's attempted escape destroyed much of the remaining trust between him and his people. To many, it confirmed that Louis was a traitor to the revolution. Politically, the revolution had given birth to new divisions. Clubs and factions emerged across Paris, each pushing their own vision of the future. The Jacobins, radical and republican, gained strength, while moderates favored a constitutional monarchy. The press, once tightly controlled, now exploded with pamphlets, newspapers, and speeches, filling the air with passionate arguments. The revolution was not a single movement but a cacophony of voices, each demanding to be heard. By 1791, the National Assembly had completed its work, drafting the Constitution of 1791, which established France as a constitutional monarchy. Sovereignty lay with the people, exercised through an elected assembly, while the king retained limited powers. For a moment, it seemed that France had found balance. Monarchy tempered by democracy, privilege replaced with rights, old abuses swept away by new laws. But beneath the surface, cracks remained. The king's credibility was shattered by the flight to Varennes. The church was alienated by revolutionary reforms. The nobility was fleeing France in growing numbers, becoming émigrés who plotted to restore their power with foreign help. Peasants were disillusioned by continuing hardships. Urban workers were still hungry and restless. Outside France, the revolution was met with a mixture of fear and fascination. Monarchs across Europe watched with alarm, worried that revolutionary ideas might spread to their own subjects. Austria, where Marie Antoinette's family reigned, and Prussia, a rising military power, grew increasingly hostile to events in France. Revolutionaries, in turn, began to see foreign monarchies as threats to liberty. The stage was set for war, and with it, a new and more radical phase of the revolution. By the end of 1791, the French Revolution had already transformed the nation. The Bastille had fallen, feudalism had been abolished, rights had been declared, and a constitution written. The king had been humbled, the church divided, and the people emboldened. Yet the revolution was not finished. What had begun as a struggle for reform was now hurtling toward a confrontation with monarchy, religion, and the powers of Europe itself. The revolution had lit a fire that could not be contained. By the dawn of 1792, the French Revolution had already shaken the foundations of monarchy and privilege. But the events of that year would push France into an even more radical phase, where compromise gave way to confrontation, and the crown itself would be swept aside. The first great force driving radicalization was fear of foreign intervention. The royal family's attempted escape at Varennes in 1790, one had convinced many revolutionaries that Louis XVI could not be trusted. Meanwhile, the émigrés, nobles who had fled abroad, were lobbying European monarchs to crush the revolution and restore the old order. Austria and Prussia, alarmed by the spread of revolutionary ideas, threatened France with war if harm befell the king and queen. Far from intimidating the French, these threats ignited a spirit of defiance. Revolutionaries saw themselves as defenders of liberty against tyranny, not only in France but across Europe. In April 1792, the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria, soon joined by Prussia. The French army, poorly trained and disorganized, suffered humiliating defeats in the early months. Soldiers deserted, officers were suspected of treason, and panic spread. Paris seethed with anger and suspicion, convinced that traitors were undermining the revolution from within. This paranoia reached a fever pitch in July, when the Duke of Brunswick, commanding Prussian forces, issued the infamous Brunswick Manifesto. It warned that Paris would face destruction if the royal family were harmed. Instead of cowing the people, it enraged them. To many, the manifesto confirmed that Louis XVI was conspiring with foreign enemies. On August 10, 1792, Paris erupted. Thousands of revolutionaries, led by the militant sans-culottes and supported by the radical Jacobin Club, marched on the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family was held. The king's Swiss guards fought bravely but were overwhelmed by the mob. Blood ran through the palace halls as hundreds were killed. The monarchy, humiliated and powerless, was effectively destroyed. Louis XVI and his family were arrested and imprisoned in the Temple, a medieval fortress in Paris. With the monarchy overthrown, France declared itself a republic. A new governing body, the National Convention, was elected to shape the future. For the first time in centuries, the authority of kings was replaced by the sovereignty of the people. But unity was fleeting. Inside the convention, political factions battled for dominance. The two most prominent groups were the Girondins and the Jacobins. The Girondins favored moderate reforms and were wary of Paris's radical mobs. The Jacobins, led by figures such as Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat, embraced radical measures and aligned with the sans-culottes. The struggle between these factions would soon define the revolution's next phase. At the center of debate stood the fate of Louis XVI. Should the king be punished, exiled, or executed? Many moderates feared killing him would alienate foreign powers and drive France deeper into war. But radicals argued that Louis was a traitor who had betrayed the people and conspired with enemies. The trial of the king in December 1792 electrified France. Louis was charged with high treason, accused of conspiring against the liberty of the nation. His defense was calm and dignified, but the evidence, letters, secret communications, and his attempted flight, was damning. After heated debate, the convention voted. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was led to the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. A great silence fell as the blade dropped, severing centuries of monarchy in an instant. The crowd erupted in cries of "Vive la République!" The king was dead, and France had crossed a point of no return. The execution of the king shocked Europe. Monarchs everywhere recoiled in horror, while revolutionaries celebrated. France was now not just a nation in revolution, but a republic at war with nearly all of Europe. Britain, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and others joined the coalition against revolutionary France. Inside France, The pressures of war, famine, and internal division drove politics further toward extremism. The Girondins, accused of weakness in the face of enemies, lost influence. The Jacobins, fueled by the energy of the sans-culottes and their radical press, rose to dominance. One of the most fiery voices of the radical movement was Jean-Paul Marat, a journalist whose newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the Friend of the People, demanded relentless action against traitors and counter-revolutionaries. His calls for vigilance resonated with the masses, though his inflammatory rhetoric also fueled violence. In July 1793, Marat was assassinated by Charlotte Corday, a Girondin sympathizer. His death turned him into a martyr of the Revolution, immortalized in Jacques-Louis David's haunting painting The Death of Marat. The Revolution had now entered a new phase, one defined by war abroad and radicalism at home. The monarchy had fallen, the king was dead, and the republic stood surrounded by enemies. But as France fought for survival, it also began to devour itself. The year 1792 had transformed the revolution from a struggle for reform into a battle for the future of Europe itself. Liberty, equality, and fraternity were now not only slogans but rallying cries for armies and citizens alike. Yet with foreign armies on the march, famine in the cities, and political factions tearing at each other, the revolution was sliding toward its most violent chapter, the Reign of Terror. By early 1793, the French Revolution had reached a dangerous crossroads. The king was dead, Europe was at war with the new French Republic, and famine and unrest stalked the nation. But the greatest danger came from within, counter-revolutionaries, royalists, and moderates who were accused of betraying the cause. Out of this atmosphere of fear and suspicion arose a regime that would be remembered in history as the Reign of Terror. The crisis was overwhelming. France faced invasion on all fronts as Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and others joined the coalition. Inside the country, rebellion flared in provinces such as the Vendée, where peasants and royalists took up arms against the revolution. The National Convention, fearing the Republic might collapse, turned to its most radical leaders to save it. In April 1793, the convention created the Committee of Public Safety, a small but powerful body tasked with defending the revolution at any cost. At its head stood men like Georges Danton, a charismatic speaker who called for bold action, Jean-Paul Marat, whose fiery writings urged merciless justice, and most of all, Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible lawyer whose stern vision of virtue and equality made him the revolution's moral voice. Robespierre believed the revolution was not only political but also moral, a struggle to create a republic of virtue where corruption and tyranny would be purged. But to achieve this, he argued, enemies of the revolution must be eliminated. Terror, he declared, is nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. In September 1793, the convention passed the Law of Suspects, which allowed anyone accused of counter-revolutionary sympathies to be arrested and tried. Trials were swift, and punishment severe. The guillotine became the grim symbol of revolutionary justice. What had once been a tool of equality and punishment now became an instrument of mass execution. Among the most famous victims was Queen Marie Antoinette. After months in prison, she was tried for treason. Despite her composed defense, she was condemned, and on October 16, 1793, she was executed before a jeering crowd. The fall of the Queen symbolized the complete destruction of monarchy in France. But the terror did not stop with royalty. Nobles, priests, moderates, and even revolutionaries themselves fell under suspicion. The Girondins, once powerful, were accused of betraying the Republic and sent to the guillotine. Danton himself, despite his service to the revolution, was later denounced for moderation and executed. Marat, assassinated by Charlotte Corday, was turned into a revolutionary saint, his memory fueling further bloodshed. Ordinary citizens, too, were swept into the machinery of terror. A careless remark, a complaint about bread prices, Even a show of sympathy for a condemned prisoner could result in arrest. Neighbors denounced neighbors, families turned on one another, and fear gripped every street. Between 1793 and 1794, tens of thousands were executed or died in prison. Meanwhile, the war effort demanded total mobilization. The convention called for a levée en masse, a mass conscription of citizens to defend the republic. Men went to the front, women worked in factories and hospitals, and children gathered supplies. For the first time, an entire nation was mobilized for war. Though brutal, this unity gave France's armies new strength. By late 1793, revolutionary forces had stopped the coalition's advance and were pushing back across Europe. The terror was not only political but also cultural. Robespierre and the Jacobins sought to remake French society according to revolutionary ideals. Christianity was attacked as a relic of tyranny. Churches were closed or turned into temples of reason. A new calendar was introduced, erasing saints' days and starting history anew from the year of the Revolution. Festivals of liberty and the Supreme Being replaced traditional worship. Yet instead of uniting the people, these changes often deepened resentment, especially in the countryside. By mid-1794, Robespierre had become the most powerful figure in France. His vision of virtue drove him to purge not only enemies, but also fellow revolutionaries he deemed corrupt. He turned against moderates like Danton and radicals like Hebert alike. As the guillotine claimed more lives, even allies began to fear Robespierre's grip on power. On June 8, 1794, Robespierre presided over the Festival of the Supreme Being, a grand celebration of his new civic religion. Dressed in symbolic garments, he led ceremonies meant to inspire unity and virtue. But to many, it seemed a display of arrogance, a sign that Robespierre had become a dictator cloaked in righteousness. The breaking point came in July 1794, known in the revolutionary calendar as 9 Thermidor, year II. Robespierre, emboldened by his control, denounced more members of the convention, threatening to unleash another wave of executions. Fearing for their own lives, deputies turned against him. Robespierre and his closest allies were arrested, and after a brief struggle, sent to the guillotine. The blade that had claimed so many now ended the life of the man who had justified its terror. With Robespierre's death, the reign of terror ended. France had survived invasion, rebellion, and civil strife, but at a terrible cost. Perhaps 40,000 lives had been lost, and the revolution's dream of liberty had been overshadowed by fear. Yet the Republic endured, tempered by fire, and ready to enter a new, uncertain phase. The terror left behind a paradox. It had defended the revolution and preserved the Republic, yet it had betrayed the ideals of liberty and justice it claimed to protect. It showed both the power and the peril of revolutionary zeal, a reminder that the line between virtue and tyranny can be perilously thin. As France stepped out of the shadow of the guillotine, a new government would take shape, the Directory, and from the chaos would emerge a young general whose name would echo through history, Napoleon Bonaparte. The fall of Robespierre in July 1794 marked the end of the reign of terror, but it did not end the revolution. Instead, France entered a new, more cautious phase, known as the Era of the Directory. This government, lasting from 1795 to 1799, attempted to steer the Republic away from both royalist restoration and Jacobin extremism. But it was plagued by corruption, instability, and constant threats. In this turbulent environment, one figure rose above the chaos, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte. After Robespierre's execution, power shifted from the radical Jacobins to more moderate revolutionaries. The National Convention drafted a new constitution, which came into effect in 1795. It established the Directory, a government led by 5 directors, with a bicameral legislature. The goal was to prevent any one person or faction from seizing dictatorial control, as Robespierre had. But this new system was flawed from the start. The directors were often divided, and corruption ran rampant. The Directory lacked strong legitimacy, relying heavily on the military to maintain order. It was a government born out of exhaustion, trying to balance between those who still dreamed of radical equality and those who longed for a return to monarchy. The first challenge came from royalists. With the monarchy gone, many French citizens still sympathized with the exiled Bourbon family. In October 1795, a royalist uprising threatened Paris. The Directory called upon a young general to defend the capital. With ruthless efficiency, he ordered his troops to fire grapeshot into the charging mob, scattering them in what became known as the whiff of grapeshot. That general was Napoleon Bonaparte, and his decisive action saved the Directory and propelled him into national fame. While the Directory struggled at home, France's armies found success abroad. The Revolutionary Wars, which had begun in chaos, now turned in France's favor. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of the French army in Italy. With bold tactics and brilliant strategy, he defeated Austrian and Italian forces in a dazzling campaign. His victories brought glory to France and made him a hero of the Republic. More importantly, they gave him immense popularity and an independent base of power. Back in France, however, the Directory was failing. Economic problems persisted. Inflation, food shortages, and corruption eroded public trust. Political divisions deepened. Royalists plotted restoration, while Jacobin radicals sought a return to revolutionary zeal. The government relied increasingly on the army to suppress uprisings, making generals like Napoleon ever more powerful. Meanwhile, Napoleon's star continued to rise. In 1798, he launched an ambitious expedition to Egypt, aiming to strike at Britain's trade routes and expand French influence. While the campaign was a mixed success militarily, it showcased Napoleon's vision and ambition. His presence in Egypt also revealed another trait, his ability to control narratives. Though the expedition ended in retreat, Napoleon returned to France as a celebrated leader, his failures overshadowed by propaganda of victory. By 1799, the Directory was collapsing under its own weakness. France was weary of corruption and constant political infighting. The coalition of European monarchies still threatened, and the people longed for stability. In this moment of crisis, Napoleon seized his chance. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire, year VIII in the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon staged a coup d'état. Backed by loyal troops, he stormed into the legislature and forced the deputies to dissolve the Directory. Amid chaos and intimidation, a new constitution was proclaimed, creating the consulate, with Napoleon as first consul, the most powerful man in France. The revolution was over. The monarchy had fallen, the republic had survived war, terror, and turmoil, but now the ideals of liberty and equality were placed in the hands of a single leader. Napoleon promised to preserve the revolution's achievements while bringing order and stability. In time, he would crown himself Emperor of the French, exporting revolutionary principles across Europe through conquest. The Directory, remembered as a weak and corrupt experiment, nonetheless played a vital role. It bridged the revolution's radical and imperial phases, keeping France alive in its most vulnerable years. But it was also a reminder that without firm foundations, freedom can falter into chaos. As the 18th century drew to a close, France stood transformed. In just 10 years, it had gone from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, to republic, through terror, and finally into the rule of a single strongman. The revolution had unleashed forces of change that could not be contained, ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity that would inspire movements far beyond France. And at its end stood Napoleon Bonaparte. The soldier who had fired grapeshot into a Parisian crowd now stood poised to reshape not only France but the entire world. The French Revolution was more than just a decade of upheaval between 1789 and 1799. It was a turning point in world history. In those 10 turbulent years, France went from being the most powerful absolute monarchy in Europe to a republic forged in fire, terror, and war, before finally giving way to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. But beyond the battles, the bloodshed, and the shifting governments, the revolution left behind ideas that would forever reshape nations and peoples across the globe. At its heart, the revolution was a struggle over power, rights, and identity. The ancient regime, the old order, was built on privilege. Nobles and clergy enjoyed immense wealth and influence while peasants carried the weight of crushing taxes and famine. Enlightenment thinkers had long questioned this imbalance, but it was the Estates General of 1789 and the people's determination to take destiny into their own hands that lit the fuse. With the fall of the Bastille, the storming of Versailles, and the rise of the National Assembly, the people of France declared that sovereignty belonged not to kings but to citizens. The Revolution's declaration of the rights of man and citizen was one of its greatest legacies. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals, it proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity as the foundations of society. These words carried far beyond France's borders, echoing in revolutions in Haiti, Latin America, and eventually influencing democratic movements across Europe and the world. Even though France itself often struggled to live up to these ideals, the very act of declaring them changed the way people thought about government and freedom. Yet the revolution was never a straight path toward progress. It lurched violently between moderation and extremism, between hope and terror. The early reforms of the National Assembly dismantled feudal privileges, modernized laws, and secularized society. But fear and war quickly pushed the revolution into radicalism. The Reign of Terror showed the darker side of revolutionary zeal, when liberty was sacrificed in the name of survival, and thousands perished beneath the blade of the guillotine. Still, even the terror revealed the revolution's unprecedented ambition to build not only a new government but a new society, one rooted in virtue, reason, and equality. Its excesses exposed the danger of unchecked idealism, but its energy showed how powerful the will of the people could be. The revolution also transformed warfare and politics. With the levée en masse, France created the first true nation in arms, mobilizing entire populations for the defense of liberty. Armies grew larger, battles more intense, and the concept of modern nationalism began to take shape. The revolution blurred the lines between civilian and soldier, between domestic and international struggles, as the fate of France became tied to the fate of Europe itself. Out of this chaos emerged Napoleon Bonaparte, the soldier who rose from obscurity to become the most powerful man in France. His rule marked both the end of the revolution and the continuation of its legacy. By seizing power in 1799, he closed the door on a decade of unstable republican governments. But Napoleon also carried the revolution's principles with him, codifying laws, spreading meritocracy, and exporting revolutionary ideals across Europe through conquest. He crowned himself emperor, yet he did so as the son of the revolution, not of royal blood. The contradictions of the revolution are its essence. It proclaimed universal rights, yet often excluded women, the poor, and colonized peoples. It promised liberty, yet practiced terror. It sought equality, yet struggled with inequality in practice. And yet, despite its flaws, the revolution planted seeds that could not be uprooted. Socially, it destroyed feudalism and the privileges of the aristocracy. Politically, it proved that monarchs could be overthrown and that ordinary people could shape their destiny. Culturally, it unleashed new ideas about citizenship, nationhood, and secularism. Economically, it paved the way for modern capitalism by breaking the old feudal structures. Philosophically, it forced the world to grapple with the meaning of rights, democracy, and the role of the state. Above all, the revolution became a symbol of both hope and warning. To the oppressed, it showed that change was possible, that power could be wrested from kings and given to the people. To rulers, it showed the dangers of ignoring inequality, of clinging too tightly to privilege in the face of rising demands for justice. Its cry of liberté, égalité, fraternité would echo long after the guillotine was silenced. When we look back, the revolution was not just a French event, it was a world event. It inspired Haiti's enslaved population to fight for and win independence, creating the first Black Republic. It influenced thinkers and reformers in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. It shaped the political vocabulary of the modern world: citizen, republic, constitution, human rights. In many ways, we still live in the shadow of the revolution. The French Revolution was a storm, sometimes cleansing, sometimes destructive, always transformative. It toppled kings, raised armies, and unleashed both idealism and terror. It failed in some of its immediate goals, but in the long view of history, it succeeded in one essential task. It changed forever the relationship between people and power. When the Bastille fell in 1789, it was more than the collapse of a fortress. It was the collapse of an old world. When Robespierre fell in 1794, it was more than the end of a man. It was the end of revolutionary purity. And when Napoleon seized power in 1799, it was more than a coup. It was the beginning of a new age. The revolution had not only transformed France, it had transformed humanity.